I'm Dr. Tariq Rahman from the Beacon House National University, Lahore. Today I'm going to talk to you about this book of mine. It's called From Hindi to Urdu, A Social and Political History. This was published in 2011 by the Oxford University Press in Karachi. It was also published at the same time from India, Orient Black Swan. This is the Indian edition. And then it was reprinted because it is out of print. It was reprinted by the PCL press. That is to say, this is a pluricentric language press in Graz and Berlin. So they reprinted it. It is still available with them. Right. So what's the book about? The social history basically is the use of language in society, where it is used. And that is always a political issue. Because you see, if it is used in some domain, such as jobs, then it affects people. And therefore, that is a political issue, especially in a country like India. But by India, here I mean India before 1947, because the book, you see, stops at 1947. So by India, I mean colonial India, and of course India before that also, right? So let's look at the names which this language has had. Well, you see, it has not always been called Urdu. Urdu is a name which came to be used in the 18th century. It was called, in most of its history, it was called Hindi. Almost from the 13th century to the 19th century, it was called Hindi. It was also called Hindavi. It was also called Hindui. These are variants of the same Hindi. And by Hindi was actually meant not the language which is called Hindi in India today. No. Actually, outsiders, Iranians, Afghans, and others, when they came to India, they called it Hind. It's a place name, right? It's a geographical marker, and it refers to the river Sindh, right? So they used to pronounce it as Hind, and that is why everything here was grouped together. They was labeled as something Hindi. So Hindi were all the languages which they encountered. For instance, Babur, Zahiruddin Babur, in 1526, when he entered India, he was somewhere near Lahore, and he uses the word Hindustani for the language which he found over there. Now, it wasn't the Hindustani as we understand the term today. It was obviously perhaps some ancestor of Punjabi. So Hindi, by Hindi means the ancestor of today's Urdu and modern Hindi up to the late 18th century. So it was called Hindi, it was called Hindvi, it was called Hindui, it was also called Dehlvi, associated with the city of Delhi. Something like the 13th, 14th century, Amir Khusro calls it by that name. It was also called Gujri. Now that's interesting. Gujarat is in Gujarat, of course. That's far away, and there is a language over there which is called Gujri. There is a language in Pakistan which is also called Gujri. So this was called Gujri or Gujarati because the officers of the Sultanate had gone and settled down there, and they spoke a variant of the ancestor of present-day Urdu and Hindi. So there are writings available from them. It was called Dakhni. Dakhan, of course, means south, and present-day Deccan. So it was called that again for the same reason, and so they called it Dakhni. It was called Indostan also, and that, of course, it was called Indostan by British travelers and Europeans who came to visit, because they came to parts of India which were called Hindustan, so they called the language Indostan. Some British officers also called it Moors, which actually refers to the Muslims of Spain, but Anyway, they used it for this language. Now, this was for a short time in the 18th century. The British generally called it Hindustani, by which they meant both Hindi and Urdu written in both scripts. Hindi written in the Devanagari script, Urdu written in the present Persian Arabic Urdu script. And so this term was popularized by the British. As I said, Babur used it, but he didn't popularize it. The term was popularized by the British from the 18th almost till the 20th century, middle of the 20th century. It was also called Rekhta. Ghalib calls it Rekhta. And for instance, you see, जो ये कहे कि रेख्ता क्यों करो रश्क फारसी. Now this is Ghalib's couplet, one line from it. And what he says basically is that anyone who says that Urdu cannot match Farsi in its splendor, just show him Ghalib's own work. Because Ghalib's work is in the best form of Rekhta. So Rekhta was, Rekhta now, generally what Rekhta refers to is something like, which is mixed and or substandard actually. But by Rekhta, Ghalib meant the language which we call Urdu. So Rekhta is used for poetry in Urdu. Ghalib also calls it Urdu, but he also calls it, he actually mostly calls it Rekhta. Now Urdu was also used in the 18th century. Musafi is a poet of Urdu and he uses it. He was probably the first to use it, although there are claims of other people also. And Urdu is associated, as you know, the word itself is associated with, horde or a camp or a military camp. Now I have got several chapters, and you see in the chapter on names, which is the second chapter of this book, I have made it very clear that although the word itself means a military camp, Urdu is not a military language. Many people have written it that it is a military language. It is an askari zuban, and that it was born in military camps. Now that is not true. It was born, the language itself was as old, actually there are documents I have seen from at least the 13th century onwards in Persian and in the Devanagari script, almost from the same age, although copied later in the 14th century, but referring to the 13th century. And Babur enters in 1526, so it's much older than that, much older than the Mughals. There was a language. This language absorbed words of Persian, just as Punjabi did, just as English did. English is a Germanic language. It absorbed words of French and Latin and Greek. So that actually the English stump, the percentage of words of German origin is less. Other words are much more. But nobody calls English a mixed language. Urdu is called a khichdi zuban, as if it's not a language in its own right, but it is. It's a language just like English, a language in its own right, born through the processes through which languages are born, and it has absorbed words of Persian, of Arabic, Sanskrit, and so on, and Prakrit, that is to say the languages spoken by the ordinary people, and European languages, Portuguese, English, and so on. So English, Urdu is like English, an ordinary language and not either a military language or a khichdi zuban. I emphasize this because very often nowadays there is a claim by some people, especially in India, that because it's a military language, it is not an Indian language. It is not a local language. Well, it has absorbed foreign words, that is true, if you call them foreign, but it is certainly a local language. It's an Indian language. And it is born and bred in what is presently called India It is probably based upon a variety of language, a Prakrit used there near the Delhi region. There are other claims I know, but most of the research suggests that it was born there, and this was often called Khadi Boli. This is the main thing one should remember about Urdu. In India, in the Persian used in India, the word Urdu, although Turkish, as I said, was used for the king's city, not for the military camp, but the king's city. Now, the king's city, whether it was, Agra or later Delhi, Shahjahanabad, Delhi was called Shahjahanabad, it was called the exalted city. So the language had the name, the language of the exalted city. In Urdu, it was called Zubane-Urdu-e Mualla, the language of the exalted city. And that language was Persianized version of the language which we now call the ancestor of Urdu, Hindi. Because it was a more Persianized version used by the elite living in the king's city, in the king's capital, that is, it was considered by those people an elite language and therefore more sophisticated. Though of course modern linguists don't believe in words like sophistication, but they did, because this is the linguistic ideology which they had in their mind. This was shortened to, instead of Zubane-Urdu-e Mualla, it became Zubane-Urdu, language of the city. Then it just became Urdu. So that is how this word Urdu came into being. It is a late entrant. As I said, most of the time of the history of our languages, Urdu and Hindi, the word Urdu has been used less. Hindi has been used most often. Hindui, this has been used most often. So this is about the names and about the age.